On behalf of all of the UU congregations who are in the Soul Matters Sharing Circle, Thomas, I want to say thank you, on behalf of them. I think it's a huge gift you're giving our congregations, especially as we lean into the theme of generosity, because most of the stuff that I've been encountering really starts to, focus a little bit, focus mostly on how AI can like expand our brains. And I really feel your work is shifting the conversation to how we expand, our generous hearts, in some ways.
Hello, Thomas.
Hi.
Kathy here. And so, as was mentioned, you are with Tufts as a visiting scholar of technology and ethics at Tufts, and you're a research associate in human-robot interaction. So, as a philosopher, pursuing a PhD in religious studies, how in the world did you wind up at Tufts and interested in robots?
Thank you, Kathy. It's an unusual story. I think sometimes when I'm been interviewed, someone would ask, "How'd you get interested in robots?" And it's odd because I really didn't have an interest in robots. In fact, quite the opposite. You could say that I've ended up here as kind of a return to the repressed, Freud might say, of something that I had an aversion to and that I really pushed against. In my college years, I majored in philosophy and had a very personal interest in different religious traditions. I was raised Christian and am still Christian, but I've read a lot in Hinduism, Buddhism, and just had a running personal interest. In my philosophy classes, there were a lot of students who were interested in computers and were interested in that particular university in AI. And I didn't like it. I didn't like when they would turn the conversations in that direction. And it was in part because of that I went into religious studies to try to integrate my interest in philosophy with this kind of running set of personal interests and questions and struggles about what religious traditions are and what do they mean, and how are we supposed to understand them. But in the course of my doctoral work and then teaching adjunct in religious studies and starting to turn toward ethics, I started to think about trying to work in a more collaborative way across disciplines. And I had a textbook that I worked on with some psychologists that was a lot of fun, and I felt useful. I felt like I was a useful partner at the table, even though people were in a different field in psychology. And so I started looking for those types of opportunities, and it was just really a accidental start of a conversation with the head of the HRI lab at Tufts around ethics and moral decision making, where our conversation kind of took off because my interest in trying to think about how religions actually play on the ground in terms of real life moral decisions, real life ethical decisions, were coming into an intersection with how roboticists were thinking about how do you actually program an ethical decision-making process. And at that point, I was older, and life had given me a couple of knocks, and I approached it with a kind of appreciation of, oh, now that I've kind of gone through this long loop of study and teaching, I can appreciate some of those questions before that annoyed me in college, but now I have. First of all, I learned their vocabulary, so we can talk. I can use some of their words, but I have a different perspective, and I can be constructive and collaborative. And that's where I joined as a researcher in the human-robot interaction lab, in really thinking about social robots and what it means for an autonomous system to make a moral decision. What does that even mean? So it's been a great collaboration, and it's led me into kind of a wider work in ethics around computer science in general.
So was your personal experience in the context of having to make a moral decision for yourself? You don't have to give details. I'm just asking in general.
It's a good question. It was in part because the textbook that I helped write with these psychologists was a book on ethical decisions, and how do you justify them? How do you reflect upon your own? And so that was kind of a spur for me to rethink for myself what the relationship was between my studies and yes, my own personal experiences, one of which was in terms of our topic around care was my eldest child was born in a NICU, had to be in a NICU after a premature birth for 3 months.
Mm-hmm.
And that was an incredibly intense time for our family, an incredibly intense context of care. So that has kind of entered into what I think of when it comes to ethics, what I think of as the larger, richer life that doesn't always get represented when we're talking about trolley problems or textbook philosophy problems. So I try to bring that into my reflection and my teaching as best I can.
Right. Now, so you may have said in this context, but please reiterate, what is the goal of your research at Tufts? Can you give us a sentence or two?
Right. Well, I think my research is trying to take somewhat of a different shape than it began. I'd say it began as a way to understand how ethics is represented
Mm-hmm.
by people doing AI and in particular robotic systems, and the difference being that an AI system might just be like an online text generation thing, or it might be a natural language processing unit that you feed it into, and its output just kind of sits there in some type of database, or it sits in a file, but it's not in shared space. Whereas a robotic system is in your space, it's a physically embodied system, and it's more often real time. So you don't have time to say, oh well, I'll fine tune that data later in the database. It's you're in a natural dialogue, you're on the street, you're in a hospital. So for robots especially, the idea of making an ethical decision or an ethically informed decision, or being able to code ethics into it, has to meet those high demands of doing it in real time and doing it in natural language, doing it with people who may not have ever come across a robot before. So my initial purpose in research was, how do we even make sense of the ways to formalize or represent an ethical decision? Do we use norms? Do we use utility? Do we use virtues? And as my research has unfolded, I've become more and more interested in care as a particularly important and kind of paradigmatic place where computation and AI systems are going to run into a whole host of issues that are usually not thought of, at least in the beginning, when it comes to.
Okay, so norms, utility, virtue, those all like reminded me of my ethics class, right?
Right.
In seminary. but care. Now that's I don't recall that being in and of itself a virtue or part of ethics, but I may be wrong about that or misremembering. So say more about that.
Well, you're right in that traditionally ethics has been this three-part enterprise of virtue theory, deontology, and consequentialism or utilitarianism. And those three are really how ethical theory is framed. And it took, in the 70s and 80s, the development of care ethics, largely by feminist thinkers, to reappraise what ethics was letting slip through the cracks. And, there's been a lot of work in the intervening decades developing care ethics as a independent, relatively independent way of thinking about ethics, where relationality is primary, thinking about the different elements of understanding another person, understanding need, perceiving need. It has elements, from the other theories. You can think about a virtuous caregiver who just has a lot of know-how. You can think about a caregiver honoring certain norms. If you know a person or has a particular religious belief or a particular moral belief about how something is done, say, in a case of suffering or in a medical context, then respecting that norm or trying to confer dignity, that has a place. But I think it's because of how demanding care is on every level. And I think this is getting increasingly appreciated in the wider discussion of care, is that it's not just feeling something. It involves all of one's abilities to feel, think, be motivated, be reflective, understand where one needs to improve. It contains all of those, but it's a particularly demanding, as we know, particularly demanding but underappreciated and under-rewarded practice in a lot of ways in larger society.
So this might not make sense to others, but have you ever done clinical pastoral education?
So interestingly, I have supervised a student doing that. And as part of that training, I went through a supervisor's training course where we read a lot of what they were using for CPE. And for me, for someone who did a master's in divinity school that was highly, philosophy, history oriented, it was an interesting, again, kind of loop back of saying, wow, I missed all of the pastoral care part when I did my master's in divinity school. I missed all of these really crucial elements about what is it to meet the demand or be responsive in a real pastoral care or chaplaincy type of situation. So that is certainly something that I have started to connect with other people as a possible. We've worked on one paper, but future effort to include pastoral care, because usually people don't think of chaplaincy or pastoral care when you say care work. They don't include that and I think it's going to be more and more critical to do so because it involves certain things like hospice care. It involves these kind of larger themes about what life is and struggles when life makes no sense, when it is unjust, when it's painful. That if you just talk about care in a very clinical way, you don't
Right.
really get that.
Right. So let me dial it back a bit and go back to because we know that piece is very complex and so let's just set that aside for a minute and let me go back to the question of can you can you tell us how you would design this caring disposition in AI or a robot? And maybe just in just one aspect of the ethics of care, or the interaction between human and robot.
There are a whole host of kind of ironies when you start thinking about what a caring robot would mean, or what it would mean to describe a robot as caring. And one way that I usually enter into that is by saying, let's think about a robot that assists care, or a robot that is part of a caring environment. And in that way, we draw back a little bit from the kind of sci-fi idea of the robot kind of containing a superhuman quality, or a full consciousness, or anything like that, and instead really come closer to where the technology actually is now, which is often very rudimentary when it comes to understanding nuances of language. And so for me, the question of what a robot would need to do to support and assist, if not channel care, would be that it never represents itself as more than it is, or as something else than it really is, because then you're already venturing into manipulation, exploitation, that is, you're already kind of diverging from a care ethic, I think. And so I think the first, one major principle would be really stick to what you actually do, and recognize or take advantage of what you cannot do. I think that is one of the things that was interesting to me in our lab working with occupational therapists. When they came and really wanted to explore uses of robots, what they said was, it's not because of what the robots can do, or that they could do something better than humans. It's what they can't do that could make them very useful. Namely, in the case of Parkinson's patients, the fact that robots do not read facial emotional cues, and therefore put no demands on the person that they're interacting with to for patients who are having a hard time due to facial musculature being harder to move due to Parkinson's. They if they're facing a robot and they know the robot can't do that, they can relax when it comes to that kind of social idea of being judged, or that social pressure. So that was pivotal for me to turn the question of care around into utilizing in an appropriate way the balance between what a robot can and cannot do, and that assisting care is really not always about heightening abilities. Sometimes it's about preserving the lack of an ability as a kind of boundary that can maintain an honest relationship between technology and those that are interacting with it.
Right. One of the things that I thought of was sometimes dementia patients can be really difficult to deal with, in that they're abusive. They can be abusive, and that is really hard for a human being, no matter who you are, to kind of turn off or not react to that. So, a robot would not have an emotional reaction to being called a bad name, right? So is that along the lines of what you're saying, and what the robot can't do is beneficial here, is emotional reaction?
Absolutely, right in line. And in fact, that is another case where people have really reached out and asked care providers, what would a robot be useful for? And it was, in fact, those who were giving care for people with dementia that were some of the ones who said, a robot's not going to be able to replace what I do, but because of my own work and the demands that the work places upon me, there are sometimes not with abuse, verbal abuse, but just repetition of a conversation because of the loss of short-term memory that you just talked about that 5 minutes ago. It's not abusive. It's just it wears on our own patience of how we usually interact with people. We count on memory. We rely upon that, and it is very draining. Despite all of our knowledge of this person is doing the best they can, I'm trying to do the best I can. But in any event, the caregiver said, if I could have a break, if I could have a stretch where the robot could maintain that type of interaction, not over promising, not trying to emote, but just maintain the give and take, and I could have that break, I could come back to my work and do a lot better. And so I think that's another, you're exactly on target, that these are the types of uses where, again, it's not what's going to grab headlines, but it's, I think more, in the long term, this is going to be what actually could become part of a useful care ecosystem. In some of these facilities, there's cable news playing 12 hours a day. And so, the threat of a robot, providing some type of interactive care, what's the implicit contrast? Because if it's listening to a talking head on cable news rant about all the people you need to be afraid of and all, maybe the robot begins to look a little more constructive than that form of automated care. So right. I think in all these questions we have to be concrete and ask, okay, what are the alternatives? But for sure that we're going to have to think of care as a labor issue, economic issue, and social issue. Yeah.
Right. So changing gears a little bit here, Elon Musk said that we need to pursue building AI human hybrids if we're to stay on equal footing with increasingly intelligent AI and robots. What do you make of that assumption?
Right. I have to take a deep breath on that one. I definitely don't agree with the overall statement, and the reason I don't is because the assumption that there's some competition with intelligent agents who have independence from human labor that is sustaining these systems is already kind of a dissociated fantasy. It's also a kind of a dissociated fantasy of what AI actually is. And a lot of these fantasies are fear they're both about making AI very scary, and then in the next moment saying, and that's why we need to fund my AI initiative. And Elon Musk was part of a letter last year when ChatGPT rolled out of saying we need a 6-month ban on any AI development so that we can get ahead, that we can make sure that this stuff is safe while developing AI, in his own company. So well, it's a really bad faith marketing scheme. For lack of a better word, it's a way of making AI a fascinating object that at the same time the tech lords have in their hand. So I don't, and I would never trust any hybrid system that his company made, just because of the testing that's been his companies have done. So I would question. I think there is truth in this sense. If you think that one can live without any involvement of AI systems, you're not appreciating how interconnected or hybrid things already are.
You're right.
And in that sense, yes, we're going to have to think about ways that we're interconnected with the technology. But it's precisely because of that set of connections that we need to think, for example, about ChatGPT's reliance upon human labor, contracted workers in Kenya that are having to label data or moderate content in order for these algorithmic systems to discern what they discern. There's a lot of what's called ghost work that is behind the scenes, that is, underpaid, that is often neglected. When we're hyping the AI, we're forgetting all this human labor that's behind the scenes, that's really helping it be, less offensive, less societally divisive. And so I think the point of hybrid systems and interconnection, again, is probably to ramp down some of the AI fear, not because there are not a lot of threats, but because the threats are probably a lot more distributed and ordinary and don't really make their way into a comic book.
Thank you. Okay, so how would you describe your work with AI and faith? You're the chair of the program, right? Okay.
I am, along with Barry Dinkin and with the help of David Brenner, who has been kind of spearheading AI and faith. It's a group that kind of started in Seattle. A lot of it has a large number of members in Seattle, and I've joined because, as you might imagine from my background, being able to talk with people that are either in religious institutions or studying religious studies or theology, have a personal interest or an academic interest, and be able to bring those conversations toward AI was something I was really excited to join. So we've in some ways been we've taken in a ton of interest, and there are a lot of people out there that see these different connections and want to be part of the discussion. And so right now we're kind of riding that wave in a good way. It's rewarding, and we need to find channels like here we are together here, find ways to reach out and connect and bring different types of conversations into the larger public discussion of AI, because in large part they have not been able to really integrate the fact of different religious traditions, cultural traditions, have not really been able to even begin to sketch what the different issues might be.
Right. So one of my concerns is that for better or for worse, religion or the sources maybe of ethics and spirituality, higher values, transcendence, religious leaders, clergy, we no longer are the arbiters of these things, right? It seems to me like the arbiter of our values in our society is consumerism, capitalism, right? I think that this is one of the values that I see in these conversations. And like you, I didn't really want to get into this, but because of higher concerns. So one of the goals, at least for this Soul Matters connection, is to give our ministers and our congregants, things to chew on, and how we maybe take back some of that public square space in saying, what needs to happen with the use of this technology. So the question for you is, what titles or subjects would you suggest in kind of guiding or targeting that conversation, the conversations that we need to be having? And how would you frame the space for religion and spirituality in that AI conversation?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, this is something that I really hope to work with folks in AI and faith to develop, and I would love to maybe give some links for this when it's recorded, and maybe as an accompaniment, so that I could get the titles right, the authors right, and get all of those things. But in terms of themes and how pastors, I mean, November's theme is generosity. I think thematically, what I would really, and it's something that I associate with the UU tradition, is really thinking about justice and thinking about how that works in practice, because that has, in the last 8 years, I think, been where some really good pushback and redirection of AI discussions have come from. One of the main themes, there's a researcher, Joy Buolamwini, who has really pushed against facial recognition because of the racialized nature of it and the way that the training has been racially biased, but also the implementation of facial recognition has been done in a way that carries racial bias and racial oppression. And that's been a very successful, I think, growing amount of discussion of instead of thinking about AI, as this kind of cloud of promise, to really ask how does it actually play in ordinary life, in everyday life? What institutions are using it? Where are they getting their data? What kind of issues of privacy and consent are involved? So I think on the pastoral end, really asking the questions, the kind of intimate, ordinary, everyday questions about how are we relating to one another? What are the aspects of communion disrupted by technology? Not because technology itself is bad, or that technology itself can be, removed from our lives, but because we can notice something different. We can start to notice certain things, and that, it seems to me, is where discussions start to turn in productive directions. Is when you point out, look at your recommender system, look at how it works, notice these details that you can bring people in to say, oh, I can pay attention to that too, and I can think and talk and connect with others around what my experience is with this.
So are you saying that AI can aid that bringing people together? Because I thought I heard you say that it can, well, it can probably do both. It can disrupt community, right? But you say there's the potential to bring people into a community. So can you give me an example of that latter?
I think I don't think that they're, in part because I think things like care are neglected. I don't think there are examples that I would call AI as such that necessarily are, I would cite as, constructive examples. But I would say, if we look at the internet and we look at certain types of online discourse, which have their own dysfunctions in some ways, but if we take a look at the pandemic and, how do you reconstitute connection and ritual and try to do those things through a different channel, I think we can see that there have been some very creative, resourceful opportunities. I think with AI, the problem is how much they're being hyped beyond that kind of more organic process of asking which community is this accountable to, and how can we design it in a more particular way. I think it will come. I think there are going to be some ways, but I think there are some major structural issues around where this data is coming from, who. If you look at ChatGPT, for instance, when they rolled it out, they quickly had to backpedal and cut off things like draw me a picture of Muhammad, or tell me something about Jesus. They quickly had to retune it so that it said, I am just an AI, I cannot talk about that. So you saw very quickly that this very hyped product all of a sudden had to say, no, we've got to ramp down and not have it talk about these controversial religious subjects. So that kind of shows the dynamic, I think, of why it's hard to have the community communion cultivating aspect of it when you haven't thought about that at the beginning of when you've designed the AI system. So I think it's coming, but I think it's going to take a lot of participatory design that isn't really what OpenAI or the big tech companies are inclined to do right away.
No, absolutely. And I think that's the scary part. Yeah. So we have 1 minute to go. So I want to, because there's a long list of questions that are coming, but I wanted to be able to ask my own question. And I think we've touched on this, but so I just want to come back to, how do you take something so abstract as ethics, values, virtues, and turn it into binary code? Are you implying that there is actually a way to do that? And you don't have to go into the technical piece of it, but can you assure us that that's possible? It's not just like, well, is it at this point, is it just the AI or the robot would mimic those values, or would it be that they actually it's more intuitive, I guess?
Yeah, and this is really the question that what's called machine ethics, which is really a subfield of really asking what it would mean to put things into code. This is debated about, are you just imitating? And one paper that I co-wrote was really arguing against the idea of what was called a moral Turing test, which is, if the system behaves like a human being and behaves the way that we call moral, then it meets the test. And we kind of argued, well, no, that means that it's basically, that means that it is indistinguishable from something that is purely imitating for the sake of a larger bad goal.
Right.
That if you make a purely behavioral criterion, you run into, well, but is it doing it for the right reasons? Does it actually track objects? Is it handing over a cup because it understands a cup could break? If it doesn't, then it's just really doing something imitative. And if you train it purely on human behavior, we don't behave that well all the time. So how do you, part of ethics is counterfactual. Part of ethics is, I failed, and what I would have done, or what I would like to have done, is X. If you just do the record of human behavior, that's not really going to be, as some people advocate, that's not going to be a great training base in a lot of ways. So it's very hard. And I think what for me, it's about, what are the pieces or the basic things that a robot would, in its restricted environment, be able to do. There's an example of a delivery robot in Pittsburgh that was delivering pizzas and whatnot, but blocked was in the curb cut at the end of a crosswalk. And it wasn't breaking any laws, but if there was a person in a wheelchair making the crosswalk right before the light changed, and it was blocked by the robot because the robot didn't know, it didn't have the sense to say, don't get in the curb cut because you're blocking people who need the curb cut to get out of traffic. So for me, can a robot ever exhaust or have exhaustively represented all of our norms and all of our understanding? I don't see that. But can we do better in the way that we design and implement a system so that certain norms are understood, that a robot understands not to interrupt when someone is talking, that some of those basic norms can be implemented in a way that, in that limited context, in that mode of functioning, we say, okay, at least it will uphold those things. So it's much more of a slower process, moving from the basic to the more advanced, rather than saying, okay, it's going to have it all at once.
Right.
Yeah.
I was a student 60 years ago, and I wish I could go back and sign up for a course. That's terrific. Thank you. I want to ask, where the public is just being introduced, I think, to AI. I mean, I know when you're in the research area, you feel like a lot is happening, but we're just starting to identify and say, oh, that's AI. What would you think is the best way for people to get introduced?
I think this is a critical question. And I've been part of groups that there's a group called Partnership AI that was a kind of collaboration between tech companies and academic organizations that I think have wrestled with this. Like you said, there's a difference between being in a research area and thinking about what your colleagues are writing, and really having a grasp of the public understanding, being able to connect to the public understanding. I go back and forth. I definitely think the large language model, ChatGPT, is not the best way to introduce AI, because AI has such a long history that one thing that I've done in talks is try to provide a little of that history of how we came up here. But I think to me, recommender systems are maybe one way that people can connect and understand that it may not look the way they think AI is supposed to look, but it is based on a lot of the same principles of using data to find patterns and retrain, offering you products, offering you media based on details that are gathered. I think that is going to be a public necessity as we enter into things like deep fakes and political campaigns that are, have already been very shaped by that, but are only going to become more so, where we really have to understand AI as something that is already, or forms of it are already at work, and we can already critically think about it. And I think the more that it's kind of cast as this future threat, we miss the real bones of how it's already operating in a lot of ways. But I think it's an ongoing question that need better answers, need more participation from people. So thank you.
Thank you.
I think I heard you say that AI is not something that we can sphere will become independent of human users. Did I hear you say that?
Right, human users and human labor in terms of shaping it and training it.
So when this one of the big co-founders of the system that was working on AI came out to talk about his fear of artificial intelligence, I guess, doing just that, becoming independent and harming humans. I mean, was he saying that? Do you remember?
I think Sam Altman and others have said something like that. And over the last almost 10 years, there was back in 2014, Bill Gates said something like that. Stephen Hawking said something like that. It is a talking point. And well, I'll let you finish your. I don't know if you had a.
Well, I feel frightened by that. And so I want to clarify that you said that can't happen.
Well, I think the question is, what type of infrastructure or institution would enable AI to make the kinds of decisions that they are afraid of? Because the problem that I have, it's not that AI can't be a societal threat. It's that it's already a set of less dramatic threats, but they're at a lower level, and we risk losing track of those. What I don't find coherent is an idea of a completely independent AI that will be able to take over the electrical grid or fire weapons or distribute resources independently of the tech companies that are making decisions about where it is implemented. Where are the servers? Where are the computer servers? Where's the energy coming from? These are all infrastructure questions that I think are being hidden from public discussion. Where are the minerals coming from in Africa to build the circuitry that, these are the questions that these folks don't really highlight, but I think they are critical for being able to think of AI as one part of an ecosystem that depends on human decisions, really. And so it's not that I want to say, don't be afraid, but I want to say the things that we need to be afraid of, I think, are much more about how we're in community, how much, what are our institutions doing, what kind of accountability tech companies have. These are the types of things that I think will change what AI is, and will also, I think, give a better sense of what the opportunities and risks of AI are. I don't think it's being framed in the most helpful way for society. And as I said before, I think it is in part a kind of bad faith. It's talking out of two sides of one mouth. It's one thing to say I'm really afraid of it, and also it's this very powerful thing that I get to control and be revered for helping invent. And so, yeah, that's the dynamic I don't like, because again, it's a way of keeping our public discussions suspended and paralyzed, instead of being able to say, no, wait, we have things we can do. This is not, this is not a foregone conclusion. But thank you.
You're welcome. Scott, I just wanted to ask one other thing, if that's all right with you. So what do I ask my Congress people for in order to protect citizens from let's say, a warlike country from using it against us and that kind of thing.
Right. Well, I think it's, unfortunately, the discussions of AI right now in Congress are just now getting started. There's a good article by a scholar, Deb Raji, who talked about being part of Chuck Schumer's recent discussion and really pointed out that the tech CEOs really talked over everybody, and there really wasn't enough productive discussion. So I think in terms of AI itself, I think it's going to take a while. There is a document that the White House put out that's very interesting that I think called, I think it is the AI Bill of Rights, that it has some very good principles to it, and that are worth really reading through, because I think those the people that were involved in it do really have some important insights into what going forward we need to prioritize. But yeah, it's, I think there are, I would really say to a congressperson, you need to get involved in the discussion. You need to listen to what these commissions are talking about. What do you think about the White House AI Bill of Rights? Because I think we don't even have a productive enough discussion yet, I think, to generate critical insight from the larger public that I think will be important. So right now, I just think involvement is the main thing, and really being able to make things explicit, as opposed to choosing, Mark Zuckerberg over Elon Musk, which is really the what you don't want. We want to have a lot more perspectives on these issues.
Right.
Thank you.
Great question.
We have with this podcast an audience of a number of ministers and church folks that are going to watch this later,
Right.
as they think about what to put in their sermons. So I really appreciated, Thomas, the big gift in your conversation here is how you lifted up encouraging us to ask the right questions. And I would actually rephrase that. In some ways, I heard you highlighting some missing questions, right? You were highlighting questions that we're not asking now. And I really appreciated how it was your perspective from ethics that helped you see those missing questions. I also appreciated how, from your religious perspective, you had lifted up, there's some justice questions that are missing questions. And yet, I would say, thinking about a religious audience, right, the overlapping circles of ethics, justice, and religion, they're overlapping, but there is a religious perspective or religious questions that are beyond ethics and beyond justice. And you, having had a background in ethics and religion, I'm wondering what the religious part, and I know it's artificial to separate all that out, but your training, as religious questions, what other distinctively religious or spiritual questions might be missing from this discussion? Because I think that's the realm of, preachers are able to lift up, hey, there's some missing questions here that we're, and so what uniquely might a minister or spiritual sermon, as we're getting ready to transition to, what might be missing from that perspective that's not just justice and not simply ethics? I know that's a big question, so it might be unfair to throw at you.
No, that's why I'm here. That's why I think AI and faith, we have to be able to facilitate conversations on that. I'm part of a group in AI and faith that's talking about compassion, and obviously there's a relation to care, but we're an interreligious group, and so we've really been wrestling with the theological dimensions of compassion that, for instance, in Islam, the adjective of Rahman as merciful or compassionate has connotations of or a history of reflection that human compassion involves emotion, but that God's compassion is perfect compassion and does not depend on feeling pain. It does not depend on that. So I think what you're pointing to in terms of the religious does interact in important ways with AI and robotics, because it is about what is the ultimate form of good? What is the ultimate form of what it is to be alive? What really weaves that ultimate horizon, or that ultimate point of meaning, where we think of perfection, we think of something as perfection, be it compassion or otherwise, and that is where our religious traditions, our stories of, okay, who embodies this to a greater degree, or points toward this perfect horizon, or achieves a perfect horizon, I think really does give critical, give a lot of critical perspective on the way AI is hyped, and the way that AI is if I may say this in this company, idolatrous, as too narrow or as too limited an ultimate goal or an ultimate achievement. It's not to damn it or curse it, but it is to say it's got limitations, or it's not, it doesn't meet every criterion that of our imagination and what we've passed on and had passed on to us. So compassion is one thing, but I mean, I think, especially with care contexts where we're dealing with life and death and birth, and these things are not about justice as articulated commonly, but really about mysteries and how you deal with deep uncertainty and what your orientation is to deep uncertainty. That certainly applies and gives a lot to think about toward AI.
Well, I won't ask you a question. I'll just say thank you for that, and say what I just scribbled down here and underlined 3 times is, and in some ways not our UU tradition, but certainly the Christian tradition I came from, thousands and thousands of years with wrestling with the question of how do we avoid idolatry. I've never thought about, what would it mean to ask that question, bring that question and that tradition to the AI discussion. But I do think if somebody did that with intent and work, it might reveal some of these missing perspectives or missing questions. You know what I'm saying? Like, just how do we avoid idolatry in the IA discussion would seem some important things that Charles Schumer's committee probably isn't going to unearth.
True, and I think you could think in terms of, for example, the icon or the iconic. If you didn't want to think about casting idolatry down, you could think about, okay, what would be iconic or lead or point toward or prime a transcendent element when it comes to technology, without presuming to represent it or contain it, but at least to point toward it or be a step on the ladder. Again, I think that with technology is an ongoing set of discussions and reflections we need to have with one another, for sure. So thank you for gleaning that from what I was trying to articulate.
No, thank you. Thanks for letting me squeeze in my question here at the end of a long interview. Appreciate it.